Happy Easter Sunday, everybody. So we are now just 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks before the first game of the brand new MLS season is going to begin. And it's also pretty much now the business end of the off season and the business end of me making videos about this upcoming season, where for these next 2 weeks I am going to be making videos about predictions, previews, and even do an expectation index where I'm going to put every single team on the expectation index and look at what each team expectation is going to be for this upcoming season. But for today, I am going to do a video to talk about MLS Cup drought, because heading into this 26 MLS season, if you do not include Austin FC that's going to be coming into the league as the 27th team, we actually have exactly half of the league to have yet to win an MLS Cup. And although majority of these teams have yet to win an MLS Cup or even appear in an MLS Cup have been expansion team in the past 10 years, we unfortunately do have three teams that unfortunately has the honor of not able to win an MLS Cup, even though they've been in the league since its first season back in 1996. And if you are a fan of one of these three teams, I definitely understand your frustration of seeing your team to have yet to win an MLS Cup, because you pretty much have been seeing every single team that's been in this league since its inception to win at least one MLS Cup. And it's also even more frustrating to see some of these expansion teams that have came into the league that have also won an MLS Cup before these three teams that's been coming into the league since its inception to have yet to win an MLS Cup. And speaking of expansion team, even some of these expansion teams that came into the league in the early 2010s, I can also understand there are some frustration in terms of their fan base of seeing their team not only not winning an MLS Cup, but even appear in an MLS Cup. I mean, their streak of that is now heading into double digit, and during that drought, they've also seen some teams that have either came into the league around their time that have appeared in an MLS Cup or even won an MLS Cup during that time, but they also see some teams that came into the league a couple of years after they did, and they also have won a couple of MLS Cup during that time. But with that being said, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to look at all 13 of these teams that have yet to win their first MLS Cup, and I'll pretty much start with the team with the shortest cup drought to the longest cup drought, and also talk about which team exactly is going to be the one that potentially is going to end their MLS Cup drought and finally win their first MLS Cup in their franchise history, because it's been a while since we have seen a team that have ended their cup drought. I mean, I understand that we did see Atlanta United finally win their first MLS Cup in their franchise history back in 2018, but it wasn't really a cup drought that Atlanta endured, since they literally won their first MLS Cup in their second season and also become one of the fastest team to win an MLS Cup as an expansion team. The fastest obviously will always be the Chicago Fire, who become the only team in league history to win an MLS Cup in their expansion season. But if you want to really go back to a team that actually won an MLS Cup for the very first time and finally end their cup drought, it has to be the Colorado Rapids back in 2010, where they were able to beat FC Dallas and finally become a team to finally win an MLS Cup, and also kind of finally now removed from the board of the only team to have never won an MLS Cup, even though they've been in the league in their first season back in 1996. So with that being said, let us actually begin, and we'll actually begin first talking about the two teams that came into the league last season, because technically with both Inter Miami and Nashville SC came into the league last season, they are right now currently have the shortest cup drought, and that pretty much their cup drought counter begin heading into this off season, with both of them of course making the playoffs last season, and both become the 6th and 7th respective expansion team to ever make it to the playoffs in their first ever season. And also with their first ever playoff appearance last year, unfortunately neither of them were able to repeat what the Chicago Fire did back in 1998 and reach an MLS Cup. Although I will say that Nashville SC, I talked about last year when Nashville made it to the playoffs and had that great Cinderella run. I really thought that they were going to replicate what the Fire did in 98. Like, when you look at how that team heading into the playoffs were definitely one of the hottest team in the playoffs, and the way that they were probably the toughest team to break down. And you know the old saying, defense of course win championship. I thought this was going to be the case with Nashville, where their stingy defense and also just enough on the attacking end to score crucial goals was going to be enough for them to repeat what the Fire did in 1998, but unfortunately it wasn't meant to be, as they lose to the Columbus Crew in the Eastern Conference semi-final. But still, that was just an incredible run that they had, and also they made some history in that playoff too, besides becoming the sixth team to make it to the playoffs, when they of course were when they basically stamped their tickets to make it to the playoffs, but also becoming the second MLS team in league history to win multiple playoff game in their expansion season. Now, heading into this upcoming season and heading into maybe in these next couple of seasons, it'll be very interesting to see whether or not if Nashville can repeat what they did in their first season. I mean, you know, last year the whole reason why they were a team that were able to make it to the playoffs and also make it get as far as they go was because of their stingy defense. And you know, last season we know the season was shortened to only 23 games, and it was only limit to teams that you face based on your region. Well, I can understand that some people will say that Nashville got the benefit of the doubt, that they were in a region where a lot of their team around them, where they play like 3 or 4 times, are very weak kind of opponents, and took advantage of that. And there's even some question about, you know, yes, they did very well in terms of their defensive stinginess throughout the entire part of the season, but can they do that for an entire full part of the season, where they can now do that for 34 games? Because, you know, it's one thing to able to have a stingy defense for 23 games, but to do it throughout an actual regular season and an actual 34 game season, yeah, that's going to be very, very challenging. And not to mention the fact that this season, yes, I know there is still going to be that regional limitation where teams are still going to be facing teams around their region at least 2 times, or in some case 3 times, but some of those teams around the region have got better for this upcoming season, and they're also going to have to face every single team in the Eastern Conference. And I know there are going to be some teams in the Eastern Conference that is going to be tough for Nashville to face to be able to get a victory. So time will tell how their second season is going to go well, and if their second season is going to go just as good as they have in the first season, don't be surprised if this team could potentially end their cup draw and become one of those teams that came into the league and immediately made themselves as a team that is a regular playoff contender and could potentially win their MLS Cup within the first 5 years in its existence. Now, along with the other expansion team that made it to the playoffs, that is Inter Miami. Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people last season put a big asterisk in terms of their playoff appearance, because they really got the benefit of the doubt, the fact that the playoffs was expanded last season, and that if you look at their expansion season and look at their points per game total, they were considered one of the worst team in terms of points per game total for an expansion team for the past 10 years, and that the only reason why they made it to the playoffs last year was because there was just so many bad teams in the Eastern Conference that you literally had to suck very hard to not make it to the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. And for Inter Miami, even though they were pretty bad for majority of the season, they were just good enough to not be like the worst team, or at least one of those bottom feeder in the Eastern Conference, and make it to the playoffs. And unsurprisingly, they of course lost in the first round to Nashville SC, although a little bit of that is due to the fact that half of the team basically had COVID before that playoff round. But even if that team did not have COVID, I wouldn't think that they would have had a lot of chance to be able to move on into the next round against Nashville SC. And you know, when you look at this team, and unlike how Nashville SC, where I feel like there could be a chance that they could win an MLS Cup in the next couple of years if they can replicate what they did in the first season, I'm pretty sure Inter Miami do not want to replicate what they did in the first season. And that, again, I just don't know what the identity of this team is going to be, and it doesn't help the fact that they literally hire a guy that is pretty much clueless in terms of using tactics and trying to create an identity to a team, and also a head coach that have no experience in the club level. So yeah, with that being said, I just don't know if Inter Miami is gonna be not only a team that could compete for MLS Cup, but maybe even a regular playoff contender for this upcoming season. Now, unless if they are able to maybe sign a couple of big name superstar players like the ones that they've been linked with, like Messi, Suarez, or even Lewandowski, or unless if Chris Henderson, who of course, as we know, he's now the sporting director of Inter Miami, and if he can do some similar magic that he did with the Seattle Sounders and build a squad that's good enough for MLS Cup, then yeah, I think this team could potentially not only be a regular playoff contender, but also an MLS contender for this upcoming years. But yeah, there's a lot of mystery of whether or not if this team would do so, and I think it all depends on what this upcoming season is going to be, or even in these next couple of seasons, of whether or not if this team is going to be in the shape of them maybe even be a regular playoff contender, let alone maybe be a cup contender. Now, moving on to FC Cincinnati, who of course came into the league back in 2019, and unfortunately, they are the only team in the league right now to have not made the playoffs. Obviously, Orlando City was that team last year, but they finally ended what was the longest playoff drought in the entire league and finally make it to their first playoffs. But for FC Cincinnati, they're now going to be that team that unfortunately have not made the playoff ever in their club history. And for the Cincinnati team, when you look at this upcoming season, yeah, I don't think they're probably going to make the playoffs, and that playoff drought and cup drought is probably going to now be at 3 years. But I think that's not what Cincinnati is going to try to accomplish for this upcoming season. What they're trying to accomplish is that at least they want to be a respected team and a team that doesn't always finish at the bottom of the Eastern Conference. And if they can do that, that's a good step forward for a team that, if I really want to see Cincinnati and what their chances of potentially become a cup contender or when exactly they're going to do so, I would say I'll give it maybe 3 or 5 years, because in order to be a cup contender, you need to also make it to the playoffs and maybe be a regular playoff contender. And when you look at this team, I still think they're maybe 2 or 3 years removed from that, and that is if there's no major setback that they're trying to attempt their third try to build a respectable MLS team and a respectable MLS squad. So yeah, I think FC Cincinnati is probably not going to win an MLS Cup anytime soon. In fact, out of all these teams, I think Cincinnati probably is the least likely that's going to be winning MLS Cup out of all 13 of these teams. And I know this might sounds kind of harsh, and Cincinnati fans kind of are sick of hearing people talk about their like the least amount of something. But when you look at all these teams, there's really not much argument you can make out of all these teams and say that FC Cincinnati is that team that probably is going to be the least likely that's not going to win MLS Cup heading into this upcoming season, or even in these next couple of years. Now, from the team that is least likely that I think out of all these 13 teams to win an MLS Cup next, to probably the most likeliest team, and that of course is LAFC. And I get it. I get the narrative. I get the fact that people are saying that this is always a team that is always hyped up by the media by saying that they're the best team in the league and that they are the MLS Cup favorite. And when playoff time happened, yeah, they basically choke and do not came close to MLS Cup. Although I will say this, they came close back in 2019 in the Western Conference Final, and have they not had probably their worst performance of the season against the Sounders, they would have made it to MLS Cup in their second season. And I really thought that this LAFC team was going to repeat what Atlanta did back in 2018 when they were able to win MLS Cup in their second season. In fact, when you look at how the LAFC second season compared to Atlanta's second season, it looked very similar, and you could even say LAFC's second season was even a slight better than what Atlanta was able to achieve in their second season and ultimately win MLS Cup. But obviously it wasn't meant to be, because they had that worst game of the season in the Western Conference Final, and therefore they haven't reach an MLS Cup. But I will say that when you look at this team, and out of all these teams, this team is probably the most ready to win an MLS Cup. And don't be surprised if this upcoming season, if they're going to finally shed that choker label that they had in the playoffs and finally reach an MLS Cup. And if they are able to do so, they're definitely going to be the team that I think a lot of people are going to say they're going to be the favorites of winning MLS Cup. Now, that being said, one thing I will say about LAFC is that as good as the team that they have right now, there are a couple of guys on that team that I probably think that they're not going to be with this team in these next couple of years. So guys like Diego Rossi, Atuesta, Latif Blessing, or all these guys that has rumors to potentially go to Europe or even go to South America with big price tag. Yeah, they're eventually are going to be sold off to those team, and LAFC obviously know it, which is why LAFC is also a team that not only they're most likely is the next team to win MLS Cup, but they're also a team that they better eventually win it now or in these next 2 or 3 seasons, because once those players does get sold off to Europe or even to South America, you don't know how this LAFC team is going to look like once that their roster is going to be poached. And in some way you could say maybe they might look worse once that of course does happen. So yeah, for LAFC, they're probably the most likely team out of all these 13 teams to win it, but they're also the team that they better win it soon, or else things are going to fall apart, and that they're going to look similar to a team that I will mention a little bit later that could also look like that. That is the team that LAFC could look like in the next couple of years. Now, moving on to Minnesota United, who their current streak is at 4 years, and they have made 2 playoff appearances, which was the last 2 seasons. But they, of course, have yet to make MLS Cup, and that, if you look at all these teams from last season, who was the one that came closest of reaching MLS Cup? It's going to be Minnesota. And I know some would say, also, should say New England is another team that closest to reach the MLS Cup last season. Well, the reason why I wouldn't say New England was closer than Minnesota is that Minnesota at least had a lead in that conference final, and they were, as I mentioned, 1 minute away plus stoppage time away to reach their first MLS Cup. And then the collapse of course happened, and I don't really need to talk a lot about that because I already mentioned it before, and it's just gonna bring me bad memories of that December night in Seattle. But this is also another team that I think could potentially be a team that finally, well, I wouldn't say end their drought, but finally win their first MLS Cup. Like, I think for Minnesota, the way that they could, of course, redeem themselves from what happened last season and actually reach an MLS Cup and have the chance to win their first MLS Cup in franchise history is actually sort out the attack, and especially find a number 9 that can score the goals for this team, because I know for sure that this team is definitely going to be a team that's going to be a top 3 team in the West and could be a contender in the playoffs. But the question is, the attack, and especially in that number 9 position, are we going to get a decent number 9 that's going to score the goals? Some would even say, will Reynoso able to kind of follow up to what he did when he came to this team? Probably will. I mean, from what I've seen how Reynoso have played in the preseason, there's definitely sign that he can definitely replicate what he did during his first season with Minnesota. Now, obviously, I don't expect him to completely replicate what he did in the playoffs, because what he did in the playoffs was a record-breaking kind of playoff performance that nobody has ever seen of what Reynoso did with his seven assists in the playoffs. I don't think we're going to see as that kind of crazy kind of version, but if he can at least maybe be 75% of that version, or maybe even 85% of the version when he came into this team in the last second half of the regular season, no doubt this is a team that could consider to be a team that could be a cup contender in the Western Conference, and therefore another team that most likely could win their first MLS Cup. Now, moving on to the next team, that is Orlando City, and this is another team that I think could most likely win their first MLS Cup soon. Their streak currently is at 6, and they finally ended that playoff drought last season. by finally appear in the playoffs for the first time in franchise history, but unfortunately they weren't able to reach MLS Cup in their first attempt, as they of course got knocked out off. They got knocked out by New England in the conference semifinal. And for this Orlando City team, the reason why I think this team could potentially reach MLS Cup heading into this upcoming season or even in the future is that they certainly has the core to do so. I mean, I said it multiple times. I really love what Oscar Pereira has done with this team, and there's no doubt that eventually he is going to get this team even further into the playoffs for this upcoming season, but also try to do something that he wasn't able to do with Dallas, which is eventually take a very good core of a players and eventually make them an MLS Cup champion. And the way that I think Orlando could do so, and the only thing that I think they need to fix in terms of making the playoffs again, and maybe even go deeper this time, is just control their emotion and also their composure. I mean, last season when they make the playoffs for the very first time, the emotion and the lack of composure in the playoffs really got to them. Like they were playing in the playoffs with a lot of kind of emotion and had kind of a hothead kind of mentality, and that's just something you just simply cannot do in the playoffs. You can't just be always very angry and have that hothead kind of mentality, because there's going to be times where you're going to have, when you don't control your composure, you're going to have some sending off that has happened, and it's unsurprised that both of the games that Orlando play in the playoffs had at least one red card that had happened, and had at least one of their player got sent off during that time. So if they of course can control the composure and actually relax a little bit once they get into the playoffs, this is definitely a very dangerous team, and a team that I think could definitely finally not only go deep into the playoffs but also win their first MLS Cup. Now, looking at another team that came around the same time that Orlando City went, and actually this is a team that came on the same year that Orlando City came into the league back in 2015, is NYCFC. But unfortunately for NYCFC, and how I said earlier that I talked about LAFC better win it now before they could, if they don't win it, they could potentially look like a version of a team that I'm going to mention. That team is NYCFC, because I remember a couple of years ago when they actually had the core to compete for MLS Cup, they failed to do so. And as I mentioned, even though they made it to the playoffs 5 of their first 6 years and pretty much made it to the playoffs every single year except for their expansion year, even during their peak of their power, they still somehow failed to reach the conference final and get past the second round. And because of that, and because of last year's failure seems to be the final straw for City Football Group, it was kind of unsurprising that they started to strip some of their squad and really started to go through a transitional period where they know that the current core of the player is not going to get it done, and now therefore they of course need to build a new core to try to see if that one would be good enough to get them further in the playoffs. Now, obviously, that's a good idea for what they're doing right now, but at the same time, there are questions whether or not if that could actually work out. And also, since this is kind of the year that the NYCFC is trying to do that process, this means it's going to be a transitional year, and that again, this is also going to be one of the least likeliest team to win the MLS Cup anytime soon, just because of the fact that they're basically going through a transitional period to pretty much build a new core, and you don't know whether or not if this new core that they of course built is finally going to be shed that label of this team being probably one of the biggest chokers of the league, and one of the team that always tends to have some suffer playoff futility throughout the playoffs. But we shall see whether or not if that is going to be the case. And that talk about the playoff appearance and how they've been in the playoffs for 5 straight seasons, something tells me most likely this season is going to come to an end because of how much the squad, when I look at it, they have a lot of issue on the attacking end, and unless if they don't actually start thinking about signing some good players to help their attack. I mean, I know they have some decent player on their defense and in the midfield, but the attack is what I'm really concerned. And from what I saw last season, where at least for the first part of the season, where they really struggle on the attack, you know, when I look at this team, this looks like it's going to be something similar that's going to happen for this upcoming years. And unless if they are able to sign some good players on the attack to really help out in terms of the goal scoring, we could be seeing the version of NYCFC in the last season, first half of, or the first half of last season, but only this time it's going to happen throughout the entire part of this upcoming year. Now, moving on to Montreal, who currently has a streak of 9 years, and we're now getting to the teams that have came in to the league in the early 2010, but yet to win an MLS Cup or even appear in an MLS Cup. So Montreal, their streak is at 9, and they have made the playoffs 4 times, and they of course have yet to make it to MLS Cup, although the closest was 2016 in that game against TFC, which is regarded as one of, if not the greatest playoff time we have ever seen in league history. But unfortunately, Montreal came out as on the wrong end of that great playoff series, and now heading into this season, or heading into this next couple of years, this is another team that if I was going to do a rankings of seem most likely teams that is going to win their MLS Cup, they'll be very low on my rankings of teams that most likely going to win their first MLS Cup, mainly because when you look at this squad, there's a lot of question whether or not if this squad is going to be good enough to once again make it to the playoffs. And also you have an inexperienced head coach in Wilfred Nancy, finally to get his chance to be a head coach of this team after being an assistant and academy head coach of this team for a very long time, and you don't know whether or not if he can maybe take the next step and able to improve this team further than what Thierry did with this team with last season. So yeah, I don't see Montreal potentially winning an MLS Cup anytime soon, unless if they are going to be able to find a way to build a decent enough squad to able to be a regular playoff contender. Now, moving on to the Vancouver Whitecaps, who currently have a streak of 10 years and had made the playoffs 4 times and had a cup appearance of 0. They also are one of the team that currently has one of the longest playoff drought. In fact, I think they, alongside with the Dynamo, has the longest playoff drought, and also the Chicago Fire has the longest playoff drought, because the last time the Whitecaps made it to the playoffs was 2017, and it's been 4 seasons that has happened. And you know, for the Whitecaps, these last couple of years, it's all been about rebuilding, and that this they're trying to find a way to rebuild a squad that will get themselves back into playoff contention, or maybe be a cup contender in the future. But like I said, you know, unless if this team is able to continue to take that next step, and if they are going to continue to go through this rebuilding process that they've been doing for the past couple of years, I would say it will take maybe 3 or 5 years, or even longer than that, if there is going to be hiccups in terms of that rebuild for them to establish themselves to be a regular playoff contender, and then eventually establish themselves to be a cup contender. So yeah, the Whitecaps is another team I think is least likely to potentially be the next team to finally win their first MLS Cup. But now looking at the defending Supporters Shield Philadelphia Union, who also has a streak of 10 years without able to win an MLS Cup or even reach an MLS Cup, and they made the playoffs 5 times, although recently this has been probably the best time for the Union in their franchise history, because they now started to establish themselves as a regular playoff contender. And really, this is also another team that if I were going to do a rankings of looking at who exactly is going to finally win their first MLS Cup in their franchise history, I would rank them very high. And this is despite the fact that they lost some key pieces because they sold them all to Europe for a big sum of money. I still think this Union team is considered a team that's going to definitely compete in the Eastern Conference, and that I think overall, you know, the Union last year, it was great the fact that they finally were able to win their first trophy in the Supporters Shield, and it was also kind of disappointing that they kind of suffer a little bit of that Supporters Shield curse, where even if you win the Supporters Shield and you had the best regular season compared to anybody else, you unfortunately would suffer some playoff fatality, and that playoff fatality was the first round of the playoffs. I think this year the goal for this team is, it would be nice for them to win Supporters Shield again, but the big goal of this year is to finally get to that next step, and that they, alongside with NYCFC and even teams like FC Cincinnati and Inter Miami and Nashville, are also one of those teams that have yet to get past the second round of the playoffs and yet to reach the conference final. But no doubt, when I look at this team, and especially now that they are really in the best period of their franchise history, they eventually are going to get to that point, at least in this upcoming season or in these next couple of years. But now, moving on into the last three teams, and these are the three teams that I mentioned before that have not made it to, or have not won an MLS Cup since its inception. And these all are also the three teams out of all these 13 teams are the only one that have actually made it to MLS Cup before. And we start with the New England Revolution, who for many people, they are always considered kind of like the bridesmaid of MLS, because unfortunately, even though they have appeared in the playoffs 15 times and have appeared in the most cup appearances out of any of these teams that have yet to win an MLS Cup, they have lost all 5 of those MLS Cup. And some people even compared them to kind of like being the Buffalo Bills and the Minnesota Vikings of MLS, because just like the Bills, they had a period where they've been in MLS Cup multiple years consecutively and lost all of those. And also them compared to the Vikings, because during a stretch of 10 years, just like the Vikings where they lost 4 Super Bowls back in the 70s, New England lost 4 MLS Cup during the 2000 period. They lost in 2002 to the Galaxy, 2005, I forgot who they lost in 05, but in 06 and 07 they lost to the Houston Dynamo, and in 2014 they lose to the Galaxy again. And last year I thought they, just like what I say with Minnesota, they came really close to reach their 6th MLS Cup, but unfortunately lose to Columbus in that game. But just like what I said about Minnesota, this is also another team that could most likely finally end their cup drought, and that there's no doubt that they could with the team that they have right now, they can definitely finally reach their 6th MLS Cup, and that I feel like eventually the 6th time has got to be the charm for New England. I know we've seen before where teams have reached a lot of MLS Cup, or even have some narrative, the fact that they of course have been kind of a failure kind of franchise, where they kind of choke in the playoffs, or in this case with New England, always become the bridesmaid. But something tells me that when I look at this current core of a player, this might be finally the one that will get it done and finally can erase the memory of this team always become the second best, even when they do reach those MLS Cup. And that, again, especially with Bruce Arena there, a guy that has been an experienced head coach and know how to get teams to MLS Cup, and he has really shown in his 2 seasons with New England that he is not only turning back the clock, but are going to really get this team to MLS Cup and finally shed the demons that they have been throughout their franchise history of not able to win an MLS Cup, despite appearing in five of those times. That this is of course finally going to be the case. So yeah, New England is another team that I think could most likely be the one that not only will reach the most MLS Cup out of all these team again, but also the most likely one to finally win their first MLS Cup in their franchise history. Which now bring us to FC Dallas, who of course also have a streak of 25 years without winning an MLS Cup. They appear in 18 times in the playoffs, but they only have appeared in 1 MLS Cup, and that was back in 2010. And as I mentioned before, that was the year when it was a battle between 2 teams to finally trying to end their drought of being the team that's been in the league since its inception to able to win their first MLS Cup. But unfortunately for Dallas, they came on the wrong end of that, and therefore their streak, of course, continued to this day. And when I look at this team for Dallas for the past couple of years, it's been kind of an interesting time for this team. I mean, this has been a team that it's always kind of like a team that is a regular playoff team, but they're always kind of a team that when they do get to the playoffs, that's when things kind of doesn't go well. And I wouldn't even say that they're kind of like a choker kind of team, even though they have failed to get past the second round multiple times. But it's just the fact that they just don't have enough quality to, once they do get to the playoffs, that they can of course beat those teams and go deep into the playoffs. And also, I mentioned Dallas tends to have that Cascadia curse where, when you look at all those playoff elimination, it's always came from either the Seattle Sounders and the Portland Timbers, and I'm pretty sure Dallas fans are kind of fed up the fact that of course is always the case. And unfortunately, when I look at this team, there's really not much that I can say that unless if this Dallas Academy somehow will produce another very very good player, or somehow Dallas could maybe their academy is going to be right around the level that the Union was, which the academy that Dallas had, which I always said that is considered one of the best in the league. A couple of years ago, they were kind of like right around the same level as what the Union Academy is going to be. But these last couple of years, they do still produce some good talent, but not as good as what the Union, of course do so. And they also are going to still try to become a team that really prove people that they can actually win an MLS Cup, even though they're a team that doesn't spend a lot of money and heavily rely on their academy. And again, time will tell whether or not this case with teams that rely heavily on their academy, would that be enough to maybe get themselves to not only be a regular playoff team, but also compete for MLS Cup. I mean, right now it seemed like that the case of teams really rely on their academy. I mean, isn't really the recipe for a team to maybe compete for an MLS Cup. But we've seen the Union all have shown that they could of course do that to compete for supporters show. And you can say the same thing with the Red Bulls, also a team that heavily rely on their academy and also reaching supporters show. And they also are one of those teams that have came close of reaching MLS Cup and reach conference finals. So yeah, I know there's that notion of saying that teams rely on the academy usually aren't able to be an MLS Cup contender and able to get far into the playoffs compared to the team that actually spent the money to get quality player. But you never know. Maybe eventually Dallas is going to get that here, where they are actually going to be that team alongside with the Union and to some extent the Red Bulls, where they actually are going to be a team that reach MLS Cup and are a team that are able to do so because of their academy. Speaking of the Red Bulls, that's the last team that we're going to talk about today, and that of course is talking about how they have gone through 25 years, and the fact that out of all these teams, they are actually the team that has the most playoff appearance with 21 playoff appearance. I mean, they only missed like the playoffs for four times, which is quite impressive with the consistency that they had. But unfortunately, despite the fact that they make the playoffs that many times, they have only reached one MLS Cup, which is back in 2008, which they of course lost to the Columbus Crew during that MLS Cup. And when you look at the past couple of years, it's kind of a mixed resort with them in the playoffs. Sometimes they would go deep into the playoffs like they did in 2018, able to get to the Eastern Conference Final against Atlanta, and that was probably the closest that they came to going back to MLS Cup. But then there's also more times or not where they basically end up to look like what Dallas is, where they just unfortunately don't have enough quality to beat these good teams and able to go far into the playoffs, and therefore getting knocked out in the first or second round. So when you look at this Red Bulls team, and I'm gonna pretty much say the same thing I said about Dallas. Can they actually get enough talent from their academy that they heavily rely on, and one day able to get enough of those talents to get themselves back to not only be a team that go deep into the playoffs, but actually able to go to MLS Cup just like they did back in 2008. Because I know, just like Dallas, the Red Bulls had that golden period where their academy was producing a lot of good players a couple of years ago, but things have really kind of took a turn for the worse, and they're not producing as good academy players to be regular stars to this team, to be considered to be a team that can be an MLS Cup contender. So we shall see. Maybe that could of course change, and maybe in the next couple years they might produce somebody from their academy that turns out to be a decent enough player, or maybe kind of like a Tyler Adams kind of type of players that will really guide this team and eventually get this team deep into the playoffs, or maybe even reaching MLS Cup again. But yeah, there you have it. That is pretty much this video, me looking at all 13 teams and looking at who exactly is most likely is going to win an MLS Cup. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video, and also let me know in the comments below, what do you think is most likely out of these 13 teams to finally win their first MLS Cup in their franchise history. But yeah, until then, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.